How to build a coffee table series. This episode we're going to start the work on those legs. If that sounds good, stick around. Hey, welcome to the Woodgrafter. I'm Andy Gile, and if you're new here, our mission is to inspire, educate and support you in your journey to becoming a better woodworker. We do that through a whole series of videos, how to build something videos, such as this one where we take you step by step, a lot of detail in how to actually build something. We also do tool tips, techniques, reviews, news from the industry, and now and then deep dive sessions where we really go into the detail about a particular subject of interest. So if that sounds interesting and you're not a subscriber, subscribe now, leave me a thumbs up and leave a comment. Always like to talk to you. With that said, let's crack on. So this is where we got to last time. I'm now taking the tabletop out of the clamps, and this is typically what you're going to see. If you've got this right, you should have a relatively flat surface. The lines that you made should more or less line up. You've got the grain orientation that you're looking for, and it's all ready for the next step, which will be to sand it and bring it down to size. I'm not going to do that today. What I want to look at today are the legs, and that's because while the legs are set up and drying away in the corner of the workshop, I can bring my attention back to this. So it's about economy of time in the workshop, something that we don't all have as a luxury. So let's crack on with the legs. Now here's the leg assembly we're going to work on today. It's this part here, and we make 4 legs. As you can see, it's made up of 4 laminations, each lamination being 40mm by 40mm, to give me an overall square width of 80mm. So I want to go ahead and find the stock for these legs. Looking at our cutting list, here's our legs, 1, 2, 3 and 4. That leg is the end panel, we'll come back to that later. And I'm taking these out of piece of wood C1. Now here's piece C1, and you remember we cut this into 1, 2, 3, 4 chunks, C11, C12, C13 and C14. So here's our blanks, C14, C13, C11 and C12. As you can see, they're quite a nice big chunk of oak, but you can still see the cup inside that. Even though this is nice thick material, hopefully you can still see that that's cupping down that way, and obviously it's bowing out that way, and that's pretty much the same for all of these pieces. Now we're looking for 40mm thick overall, and if you remember we ordered 50mm, and these are actually 55mm. So if you were to take the lowest dip and line it up with that edge there, that's where my 50mm actually is. But I need to bring this down to 40, so we've got plenty to work with inside this stock. Obviously we've got the bow here, so the first thing I want to do is to take this face, the one with the cup inside it, and make that flat on the planer jointer. Now I've set the planer jointer up for a 2mm cut initially, because I want to bring this down quite quickly, and then once we get it down to more or less flat, we'll bring that down to probably 0.5mm and give me that final finish that we need. So we now have a nice flat smooth face and a perfectly square edge. Now normally we'd go to the table saw next and we'd rip this down to those 42mm widths that the plans call for, but I've got a bit of a problem. Now at this point the thickest part of this material is running at round about 53mm, and the CMS has got a capacity of round about 45mm. I could make a cut on one side, flip the wood over and then make the cut on the other side to finish that cut. However, if I do that, I'll be referencing this rough stock against the table, and we know that this has got a curve in it, and that's going to give me that problem I spoke about in the last video. Remember, if you're taking wood through and you're on a curve, the wood will naturally start to open up and fall away from the blade. That will pinch the blade, either stalling the blade or more likely giving me kickback, which is dangerous, and it'll also make a very raggedy cut. It won't be square through that, giving me more work to do in the planer jointer. So for that reason I'm going to use a slightly different technique this time than we used on the tabletop. I am going to thickness this now, not worry about the width, but bring this down to 42mm of thickness. That would then give me a reference side here and a reference side here, and I'll also have the capacity of my table saw to probably take this in one pass. So we're now going to go back to the thicknesser and we're going to bring this down to round about 42 millimeters. So there we are, we now end up with 4 slabs, 42 millimeters thick, with a nice surface on both sides. Flat here, square here, flat here, but obviously this edge here is still rough. So now we've got this to a thickness that our table saw can accommodate, we can bring this down to those 42 millimeter strips. There are a few things on here that we need to work around. So we've got a knot here on this piece of wood, and if you look on this side, we've got a knot here and a knot here. So as we're making the cuts, I can get a 42 millimeter strip out of here. I will then trim this knot out and then get the next 42 millimeters. So where we can, we'll use some strategic thinking just to cut out these knots that have appeared as we've milled the wood down. But overall, looking pretty good. Let's go to the table saw. So I've set a depth of cut here for just over 42 millimeters, and I've set the fence in position that's slightly bigger than 42 millimeters from the inside of the blade. This is actually about 43 millimeters. Now the reason that I've set this fence slightly further back than the 42 millimeters, i.e. 43 millimeters, is I want a little bit of capacity in this stock so I can mill out the saw marks that this blade will leave. And don't forget, the pieces we're going to cut out of here, we're going to bring into a bundle of 4 to give me the overall leg, and the size of the overall leg is 80 by 80. So I want a little bit of play so I can just take out the saw marks to give me a good jointing edge, but I also want a bit of overside when I've assembled this so I can then use the planer thicknesser to bring that down to its final 80 millimeters. Now there we have it, we now have 4 sets of legs all cut to a similar sort of size. Now I'm not sure if it'll show up on the camera or not, but we'll give it a go. These are the sawn edges, so I've kept the sawn edge to the sawn edge, sawn edge to the sawn edge across this. And can you see, if I squeeze this together, I've still got a hairline gap here in this material, and there's no way that that would clamp up. And even if I force that together with a lot of clamping pressure, over time that joint would spring and that would separate. So although we get a beautiful surface from the table saw, it's not good enough to give me the joint I'm looking for. I want really tight lines, similar to that one there that you see on this middle piece, really tight so you can't even see the joint anymore. So for that reason, I'm now going to go back to the thicknesser and take very light passes, probably about 1/4 of a millimeter across all of these surfaces to bring it down to round about 41 millimeters square. So I'm not going to bring it down to the 40 millimeters we're looking for just yet. I'll bring it down to 41, taking 1/4 of a millimeter off each side. And then we will glue these things up, and then once we've got that glued up, we will then bring it down to its final size, and that will give us a beautiful finish. Now back to the planer jointer, and we'll take this down by 1/4 of a millimeter on each side, and that will give us a really good joint. So in the end, I've taken all these down to 41 millimeters, and again looking for that joint with just hand pressure to be nice and tight, and that one pretty much is. In fact, they're all looking good. So I'm now at the point where I want to glue these up. Now we're going to glue in 2 stages. I'm going to glue 2 pairs up and let those go off, and then I'll come back together and I'll glue the final 4 together. Now there's 2 reasons why I want to do it in that way. The first one is the number of clamps that you would buy, and I calculated to buy enough clamps to build every single leg in a block of 4 is going to cost me the best part of £1,000, which is money I don't want or need to spend. And the second is I want to make sure that everything lines up. Think about it, if I glued up 2 legs and 1 leg was out and I was trying to get the other 4 in, then you can start to see it's going to give me quite a complicated glue up problem. And when you're gluing things up and your glue's going off and you're trying to think it through, that's the wrong time to have a problem. So to simplify things, we'll glue up in 2 batches. Now that means I can actually clamp all of these things together and do a batch clamping. So there's glue between 2, no glue, glue between 2, no glue, and so on and so forth, and I bring all these together with much smaller number of clamps. So what I now want to do is to put these into pairs that's pleasing to the eye. So I've still got these orientated into their 4 sets. And what I now want to do is to bring them together. And what I want to make sure of is I've got the grain running in alternative patterns. And ideally, you're almost reforming the pattern of the tree inside here as much as you can. So I'm not sure if you can see on the top here, this grain is running round in this direction, and this grain is running in this direction. This grain is sort of in that direction, and that grain's in that direction. So the inside of the tree is all facing into the middle of my leg, and the outside is all facing here. So if this were to expand and contract, it's going to do it consistently in that sort of way. If you end up lining all these grains up something like something like that, then you're going to get expansion and contraction more in this way than this way, and that's going to tend to put strain in the centre of the legs, and it could bow. Now think about that. You've got pressure coming down from the top, from the weight of the table and whatever people do on top of tables, and a natural inclination of this to here. So if you're not careful, the orientation of your grain can put strain on that inside joint, and that's not healthy. So I like to try and orientate the grain in that type of way. So now I've got that understood, I'm now looking at the grain pattern. Do I like that grain pattern on that side of that leg? Do I like that grain pattern there on that side of that leg? Do I like that grain pattern on that leg? And so on and so forth. And what we're looking to do is to create a grain pattern that we like, such as that one. That's a beautiful match, but with opposing grain on top. So we play around until we get something that we like the look of. Good. And now we'll see whether we've got the grain pattern that we're looking for. So this pattern is sort of kind of doing, I would say it's going to do this. This one is sort of doing that. This one is definitely doing that, and this one is, I would suggest, doing this. So I've not got the perfect orientation of grain at the top, but I've got alternating grain patterns. And I've also got a nice pleasing pattern on this leg here, and a nice pleasing pattern here. So that's it. That's what we're going to go for on this leg. Once we get to this stage, we need to label it. So you're going to be leg A, and A, and we're going to have there, and there. So I've got this 1, 2, 3, 4 relationship, and I know that these are all in the same orientation. So even when I separate these, if I bring them back into that orientation, I'm good to go. What I'm also going to do is to mark these as a set with a very, very light mark on the top, so I know that's the pair that I'm bringing together, and then that's the foursome I'm bringing together as well. They are good to go. Excellent. Now once again, I'm going to use the domino just to give me alignment on these, but this time I'm not worried about strength, so I'm just going to go for 3 5x30 millimeters. So this is set up, 5mm cutters in stored. I've set it for a 40mm stop. This is about 41.5, that's near enough, and for a 15mm depth of cut, because these are 30mm long. Just mark out where I'm going to put these, and this is not precise, it's pretty rough. Just keep away from the edges on these end two, because obviously we do need to trim these down at some point. With all the domino holes cut, we're ready for the glue up. As I say, I'm going to batch glue these, so I'm going to do them in a pair. Glue, glue, domino, rest, glue, glue, domino, rest. And then I'll put clamping pressure right through the entire set to make sure that all fits well. I've got one of the scrap pieces of wood we've been using at this end, and one ready to go at this end, so we don't damage these outside edges. I've got my trusty glue bot ready to go. I've got my glue bot, I've got my brush, I've got my lolly stick for getting down in the joints, I've got my dominoes, and we can crack on. As always, I'm looking for that nice translucent layer of glue. So it just take a couple of seconds just to reprime the brush, so don't worry about that too much. Good to go. Just put a bit of temporary clamping pressure across that, just to help it out a little bit while we do the next one. Okay, so that's everything glued into its pairs. Just want to pop these clamps off now. This is where you need to move reasonably quickly. You don't want any of these joints just springing open on you. And just with a damp cloth, you just want to make sure you've got no glue on these edges. You don't want that sticking together. And then just tighten this down so it's just beginning to bite, but you don't want too much pressure on at this point. There. And similarly on this side. There. And I just want to come in with a top clamp, and obviously that's to make sure that we've got equal clamping pressure across this thing. We don't want these bowing and buttling at the top. And now you can start to clamp this up. Perfect. Now start to put equal clamping pressure on each of your 3 clamps. This will ensure that these all butt up really nicely, but also don't spring apart. And just check this to make sure it's looking good, and it is, and the pressure's off. Right here, just clean off this glue, looking for a nice, that's a perfect joint, that one, a nice bit of glue squeeze out, but not too much. And just checking that you've got no gaps in the glue joint itself, and that's looking pretty good. Don't forget, this is the outside of our legs. And that's all pretty good. So they're all nicely aligned, everything's nice and smooth. Happy days, happy with that job. And then we'll just clean up the other side as well, just to make life a bit easier. We will be bringing these sides down once again on the jointed planer, which is one of the reasons that we left this wider or thicker than 40mm, at 42mm or 41, and a bit as it is now. And that's allowed us to joint all these surfaces here in the final stages of preparing the legs. So that's it, so that's the first step of the leg assemblies done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let this go off and actually cure, so probably overnight at this point. And that's because I want to joint the underside of these leg assemblies for that final fitting. So we'll call that a job for today. I'll let this dry overnight, and next time we'll come back in, we'll finish off these legs, we'll cut them to size, we'll put the shape on them, and then we're pretty much ready for the next stage of joinery. I'll see you then.